By comparing careers with hikes, so some people's careers are like a walk through the Dutch polders, very, very flat. Some people's careers are like a walk up a very modest hill. Some people's well, I didn't want to mention that. Some people's careers are like a scramble up Nevis. Philippe is climbing the north face of Eiger. And if you don't know what that looks like that. His PhD is from 1999. A mere 14 years later, he is a director of research at the CNRS, a global distinguished professor at NYU. He has an ERC advanced grant of $2.5 million. Some of us have tried to get one, and it's not easy. And he is managing editor of the Journal of Linguistics, Semantics. So I've tried to see if there was a recipe to this. Part of the recipe, if there is one, is that he's published in that period 59 articles in a range of journals, NNLT, natural language semantics, mind semantics and pragmatics, and so on and so on and so on. So you have to be productive. Another aspect of the recipe is that he does theory, but he has a very great interest in data. And I see lots of the work that he's been doing recently as an extension of the data that he's interested in. More data, please. But I think the core ingredient from the recipe is one that is very hard to purchase in a store or to work towards, and that is he's just very, very smart. So, Philippe, you please give us a talk. Monkey semantics.
Thank you very much for this very, very generous introduction. So, this will be an attempt, and a somewhat risky attempt, to apply the kinds of formal methods we know from linguistics to monkey alarm calls. This is, of course, collaborative work, which has been ongoing for several years with a wonderful team of primatologists who are listed here. In particular, the collaboration with Klaus Zuberbühler has been absolutely crucial. A lot of the data we'll be discussing were collected by Karim Ouattara, Kate Arnold, Claudia Stephan. And on the Paris side, I have been collaborating very intensely with Emmanuel Chemla, who is a psycholinguist and a semanticist, and also Robin Ryder, who is a statistician. The plan is to suggest that field experiments in primatology have yielded data that are now so rich on the form of and use of alarm calls that they are ripe for explicit semantic models. I'll try to make this case on the basis of a detailed analysis of male Campbell's monkey alarm calls, which were argued in very important work by Ouattara and colleagues in 2009 to display 4 roots, boom, croak, hawk, and walk, and 1 suffix, oo, possibly with a regular semantics, possibly with a tiny bit of regular syntax. On the basis of new data, which are the object of a study by Kate Arnold and colleagues, I'll argue that there are in fact 2 apparent dialects in these Campbell's monkeys. One in the Thai forest, the other one on Tiwai Island. the key in the argument will be that the ecological difference between these two sites is that leopards are present in Thai and absent from TY, and yet you find a difference in calling behavior to eagles. And I will therefore suggest that this leads to a disjunctive conclusion. Either there are genuinely different dialects on the two sites with different meanings for a particular alarm call, or the difference is just apparent, but the relation between context and calls is much more sophisticated than one might think. Okay, so I will be comparing two analyses, one which I call a lexicalist analysis, which tells you a certain alarm call croak has two different meanings on the two sides, versus a pragmatic analysis, which tells you that the origin of the apparent difference should be found in something else. Okay? So this is just the, where we're going. So these are Campbell's monkeys. This is the site that you have in the Thai forest with two predators, eagles and leopards. And the crucial thing, the crucial point will be leading towards is that what seems to be a leopard alarm call in the Thai forest appears to be reanalyzed in some way as a general alarm call on TY Island, and therefore starts being used when eagles are present. Now, before we start, I want to add a cautionary note. When you look at semantics proper, the way it's conducted by formal semanticists, very, very little is needed to have a semantic system. You need to have elementary parts that can be true or false, and some rules to combine them and interpret the results. When we think of meaning in an intuitive sense, we often mean something which is way more powerful, way more sophisticated, and something that interacts with reason or reasoning. But for a semantic system in the narrow sense to arise, you don't need this. So there are interactions between semantics and reasoning at several levels. One is what I call scalar reasoning. Okay, so this is what happens when you infer that a certain sentence, for instance, I'll invite John or Mary, from the fact that a certain sentence is true, for instance, I'll invite John or Mary, you can infer under some conditions that a more informative sentence, an alternative to it, namely I invite John and Mary, is false. Okay, so that already goes beyond semantics proper. It involves some amount of pragmatic reasoning, but actually not that much reason. All you need in order to get this is a semantics that yields a relation is more informative than, and some kind of optimization procedure to pick the most informative sentence. Okay? And I will be relying on semantics proper in this presentation. I will also be relying for one theory we'll be discussing on scalar reasoning. But often when people talk about meaning, they think about more sophisticated things, such as being truthful, or not saying things that the addressee already knows. These more sophisticated things will not play a role here. Okay, so just to remind you, Campbell's monkeys are a variety of Old World monkeys found in Africa, and their most recent common ancestor with us was more than 20 million years ago. So we're not talking about a species that's very close to us. And so I also want to emphasize, I will not be making any claim about the evolutionary relationship between the systems that we find in Campbell's monkeys and human languages. My point will be that these systems, monkey call systems, should be taken on their own terms. They should be studied from a formal perspective as systems that have a little morphology, a little syntax, a little semantics, possibly a little pragmatics, even if it turns out that these are, in evolutionary terms, very, very different systems from human languages. So, to remind you first about the methods that were discussed actually earlier in this workshop, some of the initial work on the semantics of alarm calls were performed on vervet monkeys, and here I've given you one of the most recent phylogenetic trees of guenons, which are a family of Old World monkeys. And in fact, the vervet monkeys are right here, and their most recent common ancestor with the Campbell's monkeys we'll be discussing are, that's around here. That's not particularly recent. We're talking in terms of, around 7 million years ago. So some of the pioneering work by Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney showed that not only do vervet monkeys have different alarm calls for different predators, eagle alarm call, leopard alarm call, snake alarm call, but also, as was discussed at great length, that when you play back these calls to them, they understand, in a sense, their informational content by displaying the behavior which is appropriate to the predators that correspond to these alarm calls. So, these are examples of field experiments in primatology. So you could basically assess how monkeys call when they're exposed to real predators or predator models, to predator calls such as eagle shrieks, leopard growls, to conspecific alarm calls, and you can also study how one species of monkeys reacts to another animal's alarm call to a possible predator. And there's a surprising amount of interspecies comprehension that was built on, in particular, in work by Zuber-Bühler and colleagues. Now, Seyfarth and Cheney, in their work already very early in the early 1980s, went actually further than just arguing that there is such a thing as a semantics of alarm calls. They asked, how is the semantics of alarm calls acquired? And they showed in particular what kinds of triggering environments are going to trigger a variety of calls, first in adults, then in juveniles, and then in infants. Okay, and the really remarkable fact was that if you focused on eagle alarm calls, in infants, you saw them used for a variety of birds, both raptors and non-raptors. In juveniles, you already saw much more of a raptor-centered use. And then in adults, not just was the use focused on raptors, but on those raptors which are actually dangerous predators. Now, at this point, you could say this might in principle suggest that there is lexical acquisition going on, that the meaning of the calls is not initially known, and acquisition could mean, that there's actually something to be learned. It could mean that there's something developmental going on, but it could mean that there is something being learned. And of course, this in turn might be interesting because if there is something to be learned, in principle, you could expect some amount of dialectal variation. So on this theory of lexical acquisition, again, which could but need not lead to the expectation that there could be any amount of dialectal variation, it could be that the initial meaning of the eagle call was in fact just bird, and that the final meaning of the eagle call was something like dangerous raptor. I'm speaking very informally at this point. But as far as I can tell, these data do not suffice to exclude an alternative possibility, which is that really what is acquired is a set of cognitive or pragmatic facts. So it could be that actually the meaning of the calls is constant over time. Maybe vervet monkeys use these calls to mean something like bird, but learn over time that only dangerous birds are actually worth calling to. And in principle, you would need further data to distinguish between these hypotheses. I will try to argue that in the case of Campbell's monkeys, there is some possible theory which argues for a version of a theory which leads you to expect that there would be learning going on, specifically semantic learning, but we'll be discussing this in due course. Okay, the second species of interest here will be Diana monkeys. So Diana monkeys are here in our phylogenetic tree. They're a little bit more closely related to Campbell's monkeys with, if I read this correctly, a most recent common ancestor which was between 5 and 7 million years ago with Campbell's monkeys. Now, Diana monkeys and Campbell's monkeys tend to spend a lot of time together in the same trees. So there are species that tend to live together. And this has led to several interesting results. One was, as Klaus Suberbühler mentioned earlier today, that researchers were able to assess whether Diana monkeys were actually sensitive to some relatively fine-grained semantic properties of Campbell's monkey alarm calls. And the other simpler advantage is that you can also study these two species in the same kinds of environments, and that will be relevant in a few minutes. Now, in work going back to the late 1990s, Suberbühler and colleagues showed that you get with Diana monkeys the kind of semantic effects that you would expect if they understand in some way the content of these calls. So the idea of this experiment was to see whether there was some kind of equivalence for them between hearing an eagle shriek, which is what you have right here, versus hearing a Diana call signaling the presence of an eagle. And the logic of the experiment was you could tell whether when you had initially played back an eagle shriek, and then you played back again an eagle shriek, whether the reaction of the monkeys in terms of median calling rate suggested that they didn't react very much to the second piece of information because it was redundant with the first piece of information. And indeed, that's in a way which is expected, what you found when you played eagle shrieks several times. So when you actually played the eagle shriek, the second eagle shriek here, there was a little reaction in behavioral terms by the monkeys. And what's interesting was that the general pattern was actually replicated if instead of having as a first trigger something which was an eagle shriek, you had instead a Diana alarm call signaling the presence of eagles. Okay? And so then the presence of an eagle signaled in terms of an eagle shriek did not trigger very much of a reaction. And in the control condition where the initial trigger was a leopard alarm call, then you didn't get the same effect. The eagle shriek, which you played as a second trigger, actually triggered significant reactions. So that was, of course, what you would like to see to argue that there is, in fact, communication of information about the nature of the predators. Now, Diana monkeys are found on two sites. One is the Thai forest, which, as I mentioned, has as the main monkey predators leopards and eagles, and T.Y. Islands, which has eagles, but where leopards have not been seen for at least 30, 35 years. Okay? And the question is, do we find evidence for a difference in calling behavior between Thai and TY in Diana monkeys? And if we do find a difference, does this suggest that the linguistic systems that you find across the two populations are different? The answer to the first question is yes, there is a difference in calling behavior. The answer to the second question, does this show that the linguistic systems are different on the two sides, seems to be no. And here's the reason. The generalization was that if you played back leopard growls on TY Island, the calling behavior of the monkeys was different from their behavior in Thai. So in fact, this is what's represented here. So in this case, the open boxes correspond to TY, the hatched boxes correspond to Thai. There's actually more calls per sequence when exposed to leopard growls on TY than in Thai. But the crucial observation was made by Stefan and Zuberbühler in their 2008 paper. Namely, what seems to be going on is simply that on TY Island, Diana monkeys have not had any experience with leopards. Therefore, they don't know what leopards are, and they just treat leopards as general disturbances. In the Thai forest, they know that leopards are predators, and therefore they do not treat them as general disturbances. So that was what was summarized in this quote by Stefan and Zuberbühler. But really, the conclusion should be that there is a cognitive difference in terms of the Diana monkeys' reactions to leopards on TY versus in Thai. But from this, it does not follow that the linguistic system that they have to call to predators is not the same. It's just that they lack a certain information about the world on TY, namely that leopards are predators. And for this reason, it's reasonable to expect that actually they're going to call to them differently from the way in which Thai Diana monkeys call to leopards. Okay? So I take this to be just a cautionary example that the fact that you have a difference in calling behavior did not entail that when you actually write an explicit semantics for the calls, it has to be a different semantics across the two sites. Something which is worth calling attention to is the existence in Diana monkeys and in many other monkey species of a difference between specific calls versus general alarm calls. And there is a very interesting generalization, which I'll take as given, which is stated by author after author in this literature, which is that across species, as Wheeler and Fisher said in a recent review, it tends to be the call associated with terrestrial predators that is given in other contexts, whereas the call associated with aerial predators tends to be context-specific. Okay? So there might be all sorts of reasons for this, but this is a generalization that I want you to keep in mind, and it's a generalization that seems to hold across primate species. So in particular, you have instances of this generalization, not just in Old World monkeys, but in some varieties of New World monkeys, such as capuchin monkeys, and even in lemurs, which are very, very, very distantly related to all of these monkeys and also to humans. Now, the next step, once one had shown that there's some amount of semantics at the lexical level, is to ask what happens at the level of entire sequences. And here, some of the work that came out of this tradition by here Arnold and Zuberbühler really led to, in a way, conclusions which are not totally sharp. So their findings, to remind you, is that basically in putty-nosed monkeys, you have pyaos used as a common response to leopards. You have hacks, or hacks followed by pyaos, as a common response to eagles. But then, if you put sequences of piaos and hacks together, it really seems that you get a meaning which is not related in any obvious way to the meaning of its parts, namely something that seems to be predictive of forthcoming group progression. Okay? And of course, one possibility is that there is something just non-compositional about this system. You actually need to postulate a separate meaning for piao hack sequences from the meaning that you would postulate for their parts, or it could be that there is a compositional semantics, but that we haven't figured out what the correct semantics is. Okay, so now I want to focus on Campbell's monkeys. So they are, they live pretty high in trees. Males and females have different calls. Male calls start being used during puberty, and male calls can be loud and can be, in some cases, produced with air sacs. So we'll be relying on 3 data sets. The findings about roots and suffixes were originally due to Watara and colleagues. That's the first set of data from the Thai forest. These included natural events and field experiments. They were transcribed by ear. So on the plus side for us, there were many more conditions in some of the, than some of the other data we have. And the minus side, they were transcribed with different techniques. And so for most of this discussion, I'll be concentrating on data which are comparable. So new data from the Thai forest with field experiments and transcriptions both by ear and with spectrograms, and new data from Tiwai Island. Okay? I'll be cheating a little bit using 2009 data where they are clearer. So the findings from the 2009 data were, to repeat, that there are 4 words of roots, boom, crock, hawk, and walk, 1 suffix. The syntactic rule I was alluding to is that boom seems to always come towards the beginning of sequences. And boom was also the subject of this experiment that Klaus Suberbühler mentioned in this workshop, which pertained to Diana monkey's ability to understand that adding a boom call to a sequence modified its meaning. Now, what do these words mean roughly? So as a first approximation, boom will be a signal that there is no risk of predation. Croc will be the big question mark. You could treat it as a leopard alarm call or as a general alarm call. Hawk will be roughly an eagle alarm call. And walk basically is left out of these investigations, partly because the transcription issue is non-trivial. I mean, the difference between walk and hawk is not totally clear, so I will not be discussing walk. And O seems to be something like an attenuating suffix. So at this point, you can define a set of roots and affixes. You can define a very, very simple lexicon. The key is the rule that you have in B right here, which is this: if R is a root different from boom, you can actually suffix it with U. What about the syntax? Well, the syntax might be a downer because really, apart from this fact, which seems to have some exceptions, that boom comes at the beginning, what you see is lots and lots of repetitions. You see things that you might want to account for in terms of finite state grammars with lots of loops, but really the syntax is all over the place. So I've given you examples here with transcriptions which are croc and hawk are in standard letters, and kraku and haku are in capital letters. And so these are examples of what happens when you play eagle shriek. So you can have short sequences such as this one, but you can have extremely long sequences. And you know, this one starts, fortunately, with a lot of eagle alarm calls, hawk, but you get all sorts of other things. Okay, and so these are other examples. So these are from the Thai forest. You play leopard growls, and these are relatively well behaved. So you get a series of croc calls followed by 2 krakus. This one just gives you a series of crop calls. But when you look at the entire set of data, it's actually very complicated. Okay, so what about the semantics? So the semantics is what we'll be focusing on. So boom, boom, as a first approximation to be made more precise, would be this is not a situation of predation. Kraku, there is an alert. Hawk, there is an eagle. Haku may be something like there is an alert upwards. And Krak seems to have different meanings. There is a leopard in the Thai forest, or there is an alert on TY. The data that we are going to base the analysis on are basically distributions of the various calls. So here, every Krak-related call, so Krak or Kraku, is in blue. Hatched boxes are for U modified calls. Okay, and here you have the various environments. So we have what happens in Thai, in the Thai forest when you play predator calls, in the Thai forest when you play Diana calls, in the Thai forest when you play Campbell calls. Okay, so there are, so one set of triggers is just eagle shrieks, leopard growls. We have lumped together with these what happens when you actually show eagle models or leopard models. These all fall under the same category in the analysis that we'll be using. These are the reactions to calls by Diana monkeys, which Campbell's monkey understand pretty well. And these are the reactions to calls by Campbell's monkeys. And here similarly for what happens on TY Island. Okay. So now I'll start with boom. So the discussion in Ouattara et al.'s 2009 paper was that non-predation events were characterized by the production of two boom calls which could be given alone to indicate group movement or which could introduce subsequent calls. And actually, that's the place where I want to cheat a little bit because that's where the 2009 data are actually very, very clear. So in cohesion and travel contexts, 13 out of 13 sequences included boom. None of the eagle-related sequences included boom. In intergroup encounters, all of the sequences included boom. In leopard environments, none of the sequences included boom. And in cases where something happened with a falling tree, for instance, all of the sequences included boom. Okay, so now if we want to be explicit about the meaning of boom, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to posit a very, very simple lexical semantics, which should be read as follows. I stands for interpretation. The interpretation of boom gives you the value true. So I'm treating all of these calls as actually propositional. Though when we talk informally, we might want to say, oh, this means whatever, leopard, or this means eagle. But we want to capture the fact that these calls have adequacy conditions. They are adequate in some situations. They're not adequate in other situations. And to say that they have adequacy conditions is just another way of saying that they have something like truth conditions. Okay, and that's the reason they're all given a propositional type. And so I use, as semanticists do, 1 for truth and 0 for falsity. So this is the value of boom boom, and now it's relativized to two things. It's relativized to M, which semanticists or logicians would call a model, but here you should really think of this as a site. We'll have different M's for the Thai forest versus TY Island. And for most of the presentation, the site parameter will not play a role. And then the other thing that plays a role is the narrow utterance situation, which is, you are basically saying that boom, boom is true in a situation S of utterance. And now you have exactly what you expect. I mean, the truth conditions are boom, boom is true in situation S, just in case there is a disturbance, but no predator in S. So at this point, nothing particularly surprising. What about hawk? Okay, so hawk initially seems to be indicative of eagles. There's a bit of room for maneuver. Maybe, it tells you something about a threat whose source is upwards, but for the moment I'll just say hawk is true in a situation S, just in case there is an aerial predator in S. So why do we want to say such a thing? Well, if you look at the TI data and the TY data, you have on the left the eagle triggering environments, on the right the leopard environments, on the left the eagle environments, on the right the leopard environments. You have some tree fall environments for TY as well. And hawk corresponds, the number of hawks that you find corresponds to the yellow open boxes, okay? And you see that in TI, there's virtually no hawk in leopard environments. And on TY, again, you look at leopard environments and you look at tree environments, there's virtually no hawks. So almost all of the hawks are concentrated here and here in the eagle environments. And so that seems like a good first initial try. Now, what about the meaning of U? Okay. So at this point, we're going to make a little bit of a leap of faith. We're going to try to investigate theories in which U has a regular meaning across krak, kraku, hawk, haku, and in principle, if we could study it, wak, waku. And so we're going to ask whether we can find a meaning that makes sense. And the idea is that initially, at least, we're going to take U to broaden the meaning of the root it attaches to. And so the way we've done this, if we said, in a situation S, a root R modified by U gives you truth just in case there is a disturbance that licenses the same attentional state as if the root were true. So haku is going to be true just in case there is a disturbance which licenses the same attentional state as if hawk were true. But now, crucially, this makes no commitment as to the fact that the actual origin of this disturbance is the one that would license here hawk. It only tells you the kind of attentional state that you should be in is the same kind of attentional state that you should be in when there is an eagle. And so the outcome of this is that haku is going to tell you you should pay attention to what's going on upwards, just as if there were an eagle, without any commitment that there is, in fact, an eagle. And so for this reason, this is actually going to broaden the meaning, right? Because, of course, an eagle should not only license haku, but it should also license hawk. However, there are many disturbances that come from the canopy that could, in principle, license haku without licensing hawk. Now, what's the general motivation for giving this attenuative meaning to U, a meaning which broadens the meaning of the root it attaches to? Again, I'm cheating a little bit because the data are simpler in the 2009 data collected by Ouattara. So, as a reminder, the hatched boxes are the ones that correspond to calls modified by U. And so, you see that in leopard environments, in the Thai forest, you have not just krak, but you also have kraku. But you also find kraku in every other environment. So in particular, you find lots of krakus in the Thai forest in eagle situations. That's the blue hatch box that you have here. And similarly, you have lots of krakus in intergroup encounters. And you find lots of krakus in tree fall situations. Okay? So these are all cases that seem to suggest that the distribution of kraku is in fact very, very broad. Things for haku are less clear. That's where I'm cheating a little bit. But what's kind of interesting is that you find haku in intergroup encounters in these 2009 data, even though you find absolutely no hawks in these cases. Okay? And so the idea is, well, intergroup encounters usually are going to happen towards the top of the trees, and therefore looking up might not be such a bad idea in these cases. Okay? Now, at this point, I've given you three very simple lexical entries, one for boom, one for hawk, one for ooh. But of course, you need to put the meanings of these calls together. So you need to have some kind of rule that tells you how to get the meaning of complex calls from the meanings of their parts. And the simplest idea would be that concatenating two calls is going to be interpreted just as conjoining them. And you know, that would be fine, and that's what we're going to be doing. But if you just did this, you would make the prediction that iterating the same call doesn't change the meaning whatsoever. But an intuition that researchers have had and have actually measured is that the more calls you have per time unit, the more serious the threat. Okay? And so from an article by Le Masson et al. From 2010, they noticed that Krakow series were given more rapidly to predation than non-predation events. Krakow and Krok series more rapidly to visual than auditory predator detection, and Hawk series more rapidly while counterattacking an eagle than staying put. Okay? So, in order to capture this fact, the semantics will actually take into account the number of iterations of a call that you have, and it's going to do this by way of an alarm parameter. So the idea is we relativize now the interpretation of sequences to an alarm parameter in addition to the parameters I mentioned before. There was the site parameter M and the situation parameter S. When they don't matter, I leave them out. The double bracket notation here is just the extension of the lexical interpretation function I to the entire language. But it's just the interpretation of sequences, which could be, of course, in the simplest case, sequences reduced to a single word. And for a single word, you get kind of the rule that you expect, which is that a single word W, for instance, hawk, evaluated under an alarm parameter A, gives you truth just in case the interpretation of this word, here hawk, is true, and in addition, the alarm level is at least A. Okay? So that just tells you the alarm level is playing a role, which is what you would expect. Now, what happens if you have a word W concatenated with a string, which will be the rest of the sentence? Well, you will interpret this as basically the conjunction of, so you will get truth just in case W evaluated under A is true, and S is true. If I were to stop here and not say anything else, you would just get a meaning of conjunction. And then iterating the same call over and over again would not change the meaning. But now I'm using a little trick. I'm saying that you actually evaluate the rest of the sentence not under the initial alarm parameter A, but under a raised alarm parameter A plus 1. Okay? And how is this going to do the trick? I'm not going to focus on O, which has exactly the meaning that you would expect. Well, the way this is going to work is that when you assess something like haku, 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 under an initial alarm parameter, which is 0, you apply this rule. And this tells you this entire thing is true just in case the first word under the initial alarm parameter gives you truth. And the rest of the sentence, this big thing, under the raised alarm parameter, 0 plus 1 gives you truth. Okay, and at this point, you've actually raised the alarm parameter by 1. And so now, of course, you apply the same rule in B here to this complex thing right here. And so now you have the result that haku, the first word, should be true under this alarm parameter, and that haku should also be true under the raised alarm parameter. And when you take all of these things together, you're going to actually end up with a condition which is met 3 times, the fact that haku should be true. Okay, so haku tells you, oh, you should be in the same attentional state as if there were a predator, an aerial predator. But in addition, this tells you that the alarm parameter has to be at least 0 and at least 1 and at least 2. In other words, the alarm parameter has to be at least 2. Okay? And that's a way in which actually the alarm parameter is going to be affected by the number of iterations that you get. Okay? This is really not rocket science, but this is a way to capture in a very, very simple way the fact that number of iterations seem to matter, and yet the rest of the semantics seems to have to do with conjunction. Okay? Now, let me go to Krok. So that will be, so to speak, the crux of the matter, because remember that when we initially considered Diana monkeys, we noticed that there was a difference in calling behavior between Dianas in the Thai forest and Dianas on Tiwai Island, but that it did not show that basically the meanings that you should attribute to calls on the two sites are different. And the reason was that the difference in calling behavior could be entirely explained by the fact that on Tiwai Island, Diana monkeys just don't know what leopards are, and therefore they treat leopard growls as general disturbances and use their alarm calling behavior, which normally works for general disturbances. Crucially, the situation is different with Campbell's monkeys. Actually, in leopard situations, the calling behavior across Tiwai and Thai is not that different. But the striking thing is that when you focus on eagle situations, there is a sizable, clear difference between Campbell's monkeys from the Thai forest, which basically use hawk and kraku to call to eagles, versus Campbell's monkeys of Tiwai Island, which use hawk and kraku, and in addition use krak, which in the forest would be interpreted as a leopard alarm call. So on the assumption that the eagle situations are actually of the same type on Tiwai and in Thai, this really suggests that there is a linguistic difference between their calls, though its nature will have to be explained. So specifically, if we start from a theory that says the lexical meanings of calls, the lexical meaning of calls is entirely innate, these meanings are only sensitive to the narrow situation in which they're used, and the choice of the messages uttered is only determined by the narrow situation. Well, same causes should lead to same effects. If the eagle situations are the same in Thai and on Tiwai, you would expect the same calling behavior on the part of Campbell's monkeys across the two sites, and that's exactly what is refuted. Okay? So, specifically, if you look at the number of crocs produced as a reaction to eagles in the Thai forest, you get very few. It's not nothing, and we'll come back to this, but it's very few. And when you look at the number of crocs here produced as a reaction to eagles on Tiwai Island, you get lots and lots of them, and in fact you get many more than you find hawks. Okay? So the rest of this presentation is going to consist in a comparison between two possible theories of this apparent dialectal difference between Thai monkeys and Tiwai monkeys. So the first theory, theory one, tells you there is genuine lexical variation in the meaning of calls. Krak has a leopard-related meaning in Thai, it has a general meaning on Tiwai. We'll see, however, that if you say this, you pay a price, because one of the very strong observations, even in the Thai forest, is that kraku is used almost in every possible triggering environment. Okay? But now, if krak has a leopard meaning, if kraku is derived from krak, if u has the kind of attenuative meaning that we have a problem. Because all u does at this point is attenuate the meaning, but it would take a fairly sophisticated theory to tell you that kraku is going to modify something in a regular way, in a way that applies to haku in particular, and which in the case of krak turns a leopard meaning into a completely general alarm call. And so we'll actually be forced in this theory to posit a case of ambiguity. Okay? And this will motivate the investigation of a second theory, which basically says there is a rule of pragmatic strengthening, akin to scalar reasoning, which I discussed towards the beginning of this talk. The idea is krak has a general meaning everywhere and acquires, so to speak, a leopard meaning or leopard-like meaning in Thai by competition with other calls. And we'll see that this actually predicts that on Tiwai Island it should have a general use because the strengthening rule turns out to be near-contradictory on Tiwai Island. Okay, so I'll give some arguments for theory two, but I really want to present the two theories because I think the issues are fairly open at this point. So this is something, you know, the particular case of variation that we find is something that you occasionally find across British English versus American English. So the word pants is pronounced more or less in the same way on both sides of the Atlantic, but has slightly different meanings. It could refer to trousers in the US and to underwear in Great Britain, and that's the kind of difference that we're going to posit for croc across Thai and TY. Okay, so it is dialectal variation, but it is dialectal variation in the semantics, not in the phonology or in the morphology. Okay. So here I have recapitulated the various lexical meanings that we posit. Again, I means, you know, the lexical meaning of croc, the lexical meaning of hawk, etc. And at this point, we need to posit that there are innate meanings, which are presumably not subject to variation, but that crucially croc is going to have a disturbance, a general disturbance meaning. And that's going to serve two purposes. The general disturbance meaning is, of course, going to be useful for the TY island data, because on TY, to remind you, you get lots and lots of crocs as a reaction to eagles. Okay? But this is also going to be useful in the Thai forest as an input to the derivation of the meaning of kraku. And that's the reason we cannot make do without this general alarm meaning altogether. And we're going to posit that in addition, there is in Thai a special meaning which is acquired for croc, which is a leopard-related meaning. Okay? I will skip certain refinements that you could make. I mean, essentially, you could potentially weaken a little bit the semantics of hawk, which so far hawk told you, oh, there is an aerial predator. You could actually weaken this a little bit to there is a threat, and the source, the informational source of a threat comes from upwards. And the reason for this possible weakening is that you found a few hawks when Campbell's monkeys in the Thai forest are exposed to Diana eagle calls, which they presumably seem to, Diana leopard calls. So in other words, these are cases in which the fact that the informational source seems to be other monkeys, which could be upwards, seems to play a role. But we can disregard this. Now, I want to come to the critique of the lexicalist theory. So on the assumption that kraku is compositionally derived from croc plus u, we're forced to posit an ambiguity in the meaning of croc, even for the Thai forest, because otherwise you will not get the fact that kraku appears in all environments. But there's a second point to the critique of the lexicalist theory, which is that even in the Thai forest, croc sometimes appears to have the meaning of a general alarm call. And you can see this by basically classifying uses of croc and hawk as appropriate or inappropriate on the assumption that hawk is an eagle alarm call and hawk is an eagle alarm call and croc is a leopard alarm call. And you can compute these proportions, but for hawk in the Thai forest, the proportion of inappropriate calls relative, the number of inappropriate calls relative to the number of appropriate calls is very, very small. But for crocs, it's actually greater and significantly greater than for hawk. So in other words, that means that the theory that posits, even for the Thai forest, that croc is a leopard alarm call and hawk is an eagle alarm call, seems to perform worse for croc than for hawk. Okay? And, you know, this motivates, so these two considerations motivate the investigation of a second theory, which is now going to posit that, in fact, the so-called innate meaning of croc that we posited so far, that of a general alarm call, is absolutely the same and the only meaning that you get across the two sites. But we're going to posit that there is a rule of pragmatic enrichment which is in principle available on the two sites. So the rule works in the same way across the two sites, but it happens to yield a meaning which is near contradictory on one site but not on the other, and therefore the enrichment rule can be applied in one case but not in the other. That's the idea. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you the main ideas, and the details of the theory actually require a bit of formal work. And actually, some of the formal details are not very pretty. And they have been laid out in the paper. You know, we think that it's a reasonable theory, but it's not at all a perfect theory. But it's actually very instructive to see that once you try to be very explicit about how the system works, you're actually forced to make more assumptions than you would have thought, and you are actually forced to be much more careful about the details of the system. So here's the idea. The idea is that any of these calls, croc, crocoo, hawk, hawkoo, kind of evokes the other. And that you have an optional but in principle frequent operation, if you can perform it, of meaning strengthening, which is that basically for every word W, the strengthened version, strengthened meaning of that word, so I write this as being underlined just to make things simple, is going to be enriched not just to W is true, but all the stronger alternatives, all the more informative alternatives are false. So if W1 and W2 are more informative than W, then the strengthened meaning of W will be not just W, but W and not W1 and not W2, etc. Okay, so example, the strengthened meaning of croc, that's the result that we'll want to derive. So I'm telling you where we're going, and then I'll say how we get there. The strengthened meaning of croc will be croc and not crocoo and not hawk. And the intuition that we want to develop is that croc will only have its general meaning, which is there's a disturbance. Crocoo will have an attenuative meaning in a new sense. It will actually tell you the disturbance is weak. And so by saying that crocoo is in competition with croc, the strengthened meaning of croc will give rise to the inference that not crocoo, the threat is non-weak. There is no negation in this language. Right? We're just getting pragmatic strengthening. No negation in the language itself. In our language, there is a negation, but don't be confused by this. And we will also get the inference that not hawk. Hawk means there is an aerial threat, and that will give you the inference that there is a disturbance, it's not weak, and it's terrestrial. And the idea will be, what could be in the Thai forest a disturbance which is strong and which is terrestrial? Well, the main predators are eagles and leopards. Therefore, you would expect there to be a lot of leopard-related uses if you apply this strengthening rule in the Thai forest. Why will we not see the strengthening rule at work on TY Island? I mean, if you had the strengthening rule at work on TY Island, well, you know, same causes should have the same effects, and you should have the same calling behavior, but we don't find this. Why is this? The idea will be that on TY Island, for lack of ground predators, the rule gives rise to a meaning which is near contradictory. And therefore, because it's a pragmatic rule that you can apply or not apply, it will just fail to be applied on TY Island. That's the idea. Now, here I have represented the asymmetric entailment relations that we want to have. Okay, and now flag, we are changing the semantic system to get this to work, right? So crocoo are still going to be derived from croc and hawk. But before I argued that oo broadens the meaning. But now I crucially want oo to give you a stronger meaning. It's attenuated not in the sense that it's broader in terms of its range of applications, but it's attenuated in the sense that it tells you, oh, there's actually a weak croc-type threat. Or rather, as we'll see in a second, I am currently attending to a weak croc-like threat. I'm attending to a weak hawk-like threat. Okay? So, crocoo will be more informative than croc. Croc will have this general alarm meaning, and therefore Hawk will be more informative than Croc. So when you have a line and something is above, a word is above another word, it's strictly more informative than it, and Haku will be strictly more informative than Hawk. Okay? So how can we get this? Well, that's by basically adopting a new semantics, the one that I just described. RU, so a root R modified by U is true just in case there is a disturbance which licenses R, but is weak among the disturbances that license R. Okay? Okay, now, if I were to stop here, there would actually be a problem in this system. That's where, you know, being specific about the details really, really matters. Here is why. You get lots of things like a certain series of Kraku. There's a little star here to say that's an arbitrary number of Krakus. Then you have Hawk, and then there's an arbitrary number of Krakus. You'll find sequences of that sort. But if you actually look at the lexical meanings that we had, there should be basically something contradictory about this, because Kraku now is attenuative in the sense of telling you that the threat is weak. But Hawk is still telling you, as it did in the earlier system, that there is an aerial threat or there is, you know, an aerial predator. But how could it be that there is an aerial predator and that that predator, which presumably is very, very serious, is actually a threat which is weak among all the disturbances that you can find? And that's what you would have if you applied the system as it currently is. And that's a very bad result. Okay? So we're just forced to say that basically calls provide information about the speaker's state of mind at the very moment at which they are uttered. And this state of mind can change very quickly. It could be that there's considerable alarm at t and then a more quiet state at t plus 1. Maybe it's even the case that alarm gets discharged as calls get uttered, but we don't know this. And if you do this, you can actually redo everything by having a time parameter on your interpretation function, and you kind of avoid this problem of having inconsistency because you're actually predicating different things of different times. Okay? Now, there's all sorts of technical details which I really do not want to elaborate upon. It turns out that once you have the time parameter, you can use it to do what the alarm parameter was doing before, so you're not going to have a system which has all of the parameters that we discussed. You can make do with this single parameter doing some other work. That's not so crucial. Okay? Now, here I have stated explicitly the pragmatics. So this is just exactly what I said before, just, you know, stated explicitly. So I have here the strength and meaning of W. And this is true in a situation S at a time t, just in case W it is true, and every alternative to W which entails it, I should have said asymmetrically entails it, is false. Okay? Okay, so now, how will we get the difference between the Thai forest and TY Island? We posit a pragmatic rule which crucially can be exactly the same rule across the two sites, which is a rule which I call strengthening avoidance. So if I cite M, so that's finally where the site parameter plays a role, right? If I cite M, for every situation S in M, for every time T, the strengthened version of W, that's underlying W, is false, then you should interpret an utterance of W without strengthening. This just tells you don't do something silly. Don't interpret something with pragmatic strengthening when the site that you live in is such that this pragmatic strengthening will yield essentially neo-contradictions. And so on the basis of this pragmatic rule, which again is the same across the two sites, you get the result that strengthening will usually apply in Thai, and Croc will usually refer to leopards. In principle, it could be that the rule doesn't always apply. And you may remember that we had a few cases in the Thai forest where Croc was used, quote unquote, inappropriately in environments that did not involve leopards. And this, in principle, is the kind of thing you would expect from a pragmatic rule. And on TY Island, the rule doesn't apply simply because it yields contradictions. So, first conclusion. We saw that the system of Campbell's monkeys seems to have a simple morphological structure with one root, boom, which is never suffixed, 3 roots which can be suffixed with oo, and it's at least possible that each other calls and also oo have a regular meaning. We saw, again, building on work by Kate Arnold and colleagues, that there's apparent dialectal difference between Thai and TY. We explored 2 theories. One said there is a lexical difference, and therefore there has to be a lexical acquisition in the semantics. And the second theory said there is, in fact, a context-sensitive strengthening rule. So it's very crucial to see that in the second theory, in principle, absolutely everything, including if you so desired, the pragmatic rule could be innate. It's because of the sophisticated nature of the pragmatic rule that it turns out to be sensitive to the details of the environment. But in fact, there need not be any acquisition whatsoever going on according to theory 2. Okay? And I argued very cautiously that there are 2 arguments for theory 2. One is that if the meaning of croc-oo is compositionally derived from croc plus oo, then croc must have a general meaning even in the Thai forest, and therefore you're forced to posit an ambiguity anyway. And in addition, even in Thai, croc is arguably sometimes a general alarm call. Now, remember now this generalization, which I mentioned towards the beginning of this talk, that across monkey species, it tends to be the case that if there is a general alarm call, it turns out to be the call which is used for ground predators. And even though initially the Thai data seem to suggest that croc is not a general alarm call, considering the TY data together with the Thai data explored in greater detail actually leads us to posit a theory that falls very well, an analysis that falls very well under this generalization, which seems to hold across monkey species and beyond. Now, second part of the conclusion, now I'm just speaking for myself. In my personal view, it's too early to tell which relation, if any, this system bears to human language. So specifically, I do not claim that there are non-trivial properties that are shared between Campbell's monkey calls and human languages. However, whether there is such a connection or not, the general methods of formal linguistics can help sharpen theories and achieve greater explicitness and predictive power in the analysis of these calls. And I think that in the end, this formal description is needed if one wants to offer a detailed comparison between call systems, among call systems, and between call systems and human language. Now, of course, the next step should be to look at monkey calls that have a simpler and more regular syntax. It's very unfortunate that at this point we understand so little about the syntax of Campbell's monkey calls. And of course, we would like to go to ape communication systems. Now, for linguists and other scientists who are interested in this, one of the key issues to foster collaborations between primatologists and theoreticians from other fields is to actually make some of the data available. So we're currently working, and this is coordinated by Ansel, working within my project. We're trying to set up a primate sequence website, which will encourage primatologists to upload part of their raw data, ideally in the form of transcriptions with additional information, and make part of the data open access so that whoever is interested can actually take a look and start thinking of possible theories. Then it's very crucial in this kind of work that it be collaborative, because the data are extremely hard to get. So the principle should be whenever a primatologist collected data, if work comes out of this, it should be collaborative work. And therefore the principle of the website will be, if you want to have access to the full set of data, you should contact the owners of the data and basically propose some form of a collaboration. So I hope at least to have suggested that there is some non-trivial structure to some monkey calls, and that formal linguistics has something to bring to this investigation. Thank you very much. So there's 2 points here. Of course, using a semantics doesn't mean that you know the semantics, let alone that you know the theory of that semantics. So it's never been the claim of any semanticist that, for that matter, humans know Montague semantics in the theoretical sense. In fact, it takes a lot of time to teach Montague semantics. So that's not the point at all. The point which is correct, however, is that if you ask about adequacy conditions, you could apply adequacy conditions to a variety of systems. That's totally correct. It could be more or less trivial. I think in these cases it's not trivial. So I think it's very informative to apply a theory with adequacy conditions to these systems. But conceptually, the point, one of the points that you're making, not the last one, is correct, that it takes very little to be able to apply a theory based on truth conditions to a system. And I would absolutely take the consequences of this and in principle look at other species, and sometimes it's going to be interesting, sometimes it's not going to be interesting. It's very crucial, I think, to realize that formal semantics, as it is conducted, is a very modular system. So for semantics proper, you need very, very little. For scalar reasoning, which I crucially used in the second theory, you need a little bit more, because you need some kind of asymmetric entailment relations if you do things along the lines that I did. If you go to other parts of formal semantics as it's practiced today, you go to certain areas of pragmatics. Being truthful, not saying something which is redundant. When you go to presupposition theory, you get much more powerful systems. And the point is exactly that if you just look at semantics in the very narrow sense, yes, it could be applied to lots and lots of systems. And I don't take this at all to be a problem. It doesn't make a prediction, right? It's a purely methodological stance. It just tells you, in principle, you can apply these tools to a variety of systems. And my claim is just, we should try, and we should see where this leads us, which conceptual questions this raises, and whether our tools can eventually bring some amount of light to these systems. And so in the case at hand, I think the judges are going to be, in the end, primatologists. The question is going to be whether for them it's actually enlightening to see some of these systems at work.
Just a clarification question. For a while you were saying that repetition was like ratcheting up, and there was a period where I thought you were saying that it was like ratcheting down. And so if you've got, crackle, 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 you're ratcheting up, ratcheting down, ratcheting up, ratcheting down.
So the effects will be different in the following sense, that repetition has an effect on the alarm parameter. U has an effect on the lexical meaning. Okay, so in principle, there could be different things. Now, you could really wonder what's going to happen in the end when you have a lot of kraku, for instance, which you find in all sorts of circumstances. The prediction tells you there is still a relation between the length of the sequence and the nature of the threat. So the longer the sequence, the more urgent the threat. But you still get the effect that you have kraku instead of krak gives you a weakened meaning. And there need not be a contradiction. It just tells you having lots of krakus has more urgency than having just one kraku, but having one kraku is going to give you a less severe alarm than having one krak.
I lost track at some point of boom boom. So don't you make a prediction that you should get a contradiction when you say boom boom hop? Or did I get that wrong? Because you have, doesn't boom boom mean there's no situation of predation happening?
Yes.
And then so in your very final version, you had a kind of time sensitive.
Yes.
So you go boom boom hawk at T. Don't you predict that the hawk should really mean either it should be a contradiction or it should really mean hawk and you should ignore the boom boom, in which case it's a false prediction.
Yes, no. So I think unless you tinker with the meaning of hawk, you would expect that when you have boom boom, you don't have hawks. Right. There's a proviso to this, which was you know, it could be that we actually need to refine a little bit the meaning of hoc. Oops. Yeah. Okay, so the point was that there are a few cases in which you get hawks as a reaction to Diana monkey's leopard calls. Okay, and so we, at this point, we tinkered a little bit with the meaning of hawk. We said, well, there is a threat according to an informational source which is upwards. And the idea was because Diana monkeys are presumably calling from the trees, that could cover this case. But this was a little bit hokey, and so I think your point is exactly well taken, that would predict that when you have, that you do not have boom with hawk. And, you know, we need to go back to the data and check.
Okay, so you may not have that.
No.
Okay. That's true. That's kind of
So we can look, I mean, here we have, these are the 2009 data. Again, the computations that we had were actually in more recent data, but in these particular data, you see that you have boom boom in intergroup encounters, tree fall situations, cohesion and travel situations, and you have, in these cases, 0 hawks. You don't have any hawks. You have hawku, but you don't have any hawks. And we'd need to, you know, after the presentation, we can go through the data that we got from the 2 more recent data sets. But so that's the, you know, modulo the proviso, that's the prediction that we would like to make. But I mean, to say that it's a prediction is a bit of a big word, because of course the generalizations are based on these data. So I don't want to make too much of this, but yeah, I think that's correct. They're relatively far, but the crucial thing is that TY Island has been separated from the mainland for a while, and that, you know, you have no leopards on TY Island, and there are leopards in the Thai forest.
It was separated from the land. So apparently the data are fantastic, and
Can you speak up a little bit?
in addition to formal semantics, like those that take the existence of two dialects, we're getting a bit into primary historical linguistics. And if the form is similar and only the meaning, it looks like it has been the meaning changed, either in one group or in the other group.
This is exactly correct. So just to summarize the point, if we go with the first theory, which is the lexical variation theory, we would like to have, you know, some mechanism of acquisition and historical evolution of the meaning of the call. Just one note about this. I mean, if you talk to primatologists, they'll tell you there's 0 reason to think that genetically the monkeys from TY and the monkey from Thai are different enough to explain any of these data. So I'm setting this aside. I'm going exactly with your point. In principle, if we go with the first theory, we would want to have some mechanism of historical evolution of these calls. Now, in the manuscript that we have online, we basically start asking these questions. We do not answer them. We basically ask exactly these questions in terms of very, very elementary game theoretic approaches to meaning, asking whether one kind of meaning could turn out to be stable or unstable in one environment or in the other. But I really think that in the end, if the first theory is correct, an historical story will have to be told, and presumably using the kind of tools that people use either in historical linguistics and or in formal semantics and formal pragmatics.
Is there evidence that the two groups were closer in contact or
I know of no evidence, but again, when you talk to primatologists, they tell you given the time it takes for there to be genetic difference which affect vocalizations, it's very, very, very unlikely that genetic differences are the cause of the observations that we made.
Okay, there's a question here. Yeah, so I was wondering about the justification of treating it all as declaratives.
About what?
Treating it all as declaratives. So in particular, I was wondering why, so repeating a word would be make an assertion about the alarm level rather than, for example, a proposal to increase the alarm level.
Really, at this point, this is for lack of a better theory. I mean, we really wanted to start from the simplest theory, which just tells you there's adequacy conditions. I mean, a call is appropriate, it's not appropriate. If you have the notion of being appropriate, you can, call it by any name. It's going to be a notational variant of having truth conditions. Now, we could go with something more complex. To a certain extent, we were forced to enrich the theory in the second analysis I proposed, not along these dimensions, but along the dimension of the kind of parameters that we posit. And it could be that it will turn out that adequacy conditions are not sufficient. But at this point, I want to stick with the simplest theory because things are complex enough as they are.
Yeah, I'd just like to understand the pragmatic scale a little bit better. And I think I maybe just asking you to repeat yourself actually, in some clarification. So, is that it? Go back to the original one. Because I want to understand how the OO works. So the OO seems to be a sort of attenuating
Yes.
thing, and yet it's based higher on this
Yes.
information scale. And is that why you introduced the time period?
Yes.
So would a human language equivalent be something like the number scale, but with things like 5, 5-ish, 6, 6-ish? Is that the sort of thing?
Okay, so it might be. So okay, let me just give you the relevant rule so that we know what we're talking about. So that's the revised. The original analysis was the one on which "oo" broadened the meaning. The second analysis is the one on which "oo" makes the meaning stronger, right? So it tells you. Okay, and so the reason we did this was because we wanted to capture the intuition that croc acquires a leopard meaning in the Thai forest by competition with crocroo and hawk. Okay, that was the intuitive idea that we had right here. We wanted the result that the strengthened meaning of croc is going to mean croc and not crocroo and not hawk. If crocroo were weaker than croc, this wouldn't work. Right? You couldn't strengthen in this way at all. That's the reason the second theory had actually to posit a different meaning for "oo," one that said it's actually a disturbance which is weak among the disturbances that license the root R. Now, whether "ish," as in 5-ish, works in this way is a bit complicated because it really depends on your analysis of 5-ish, and in particular, whether, in cases like, in like downwind and tailing environments in particular, whether you still preserve the component of the meaning, which is that 5-ish means something different from 5. And so I don't want to be committal on this particular issue. But the logic was we cannot make do with the first analysis to derive this result. That's the reason we had to modify the meaning of "oo."
A clarification question. I wonder whether your morphological analysis has some alternatives. Could we replace the analysis in terms of roots and affixes, find analysis in terms of, say, bases and clitics? Eclitic is something that cannot make after phonetic word without combining
So two answers to your question. So about the suffix "u," there are in principle, of course, alternative analyses. At this point, anything that you can analyze as having a meaning that modifies the meaning of the root would give us the same effects. Now, it could even be, this was suggested by someone at a semantics conference, that in fact you have a phonological process going on, that maybe "u" should really be reanalyzed as the byproduct of a certain phonological process. It's not clear that the details are going to matter so much for the semantics, as long as you can state a semantics which is analogous to the one that I stated here. So I'm open to any number of analyses, and I think, input from phoneticians, phonologists, and so on will be very helpful. Now, concerning what counts as the end of a sequence, this does matter in principle, and it's an experimental problem as well, because you find these things which are very, very long sequences, but lots of things can happen between the trigger and what seems to be the end of the sequence, and you're never sure what the end of the sequence is. However, basically, due to the nature of the semantics, a large part of the semantics, not all of the semantics, is not so sensitive to this because it's in part a conjunctive semantics. But it's true that what counts as the eventual alarm level which is reached depends on the identity of the sequence, and therefore we, of course, would like to have clear criteria of what counts as the end of one of these sequences.
Yes, it would be nice to have the boundaries of the sequence.
Excuse me, there's other questions. I want to allow 3 more questions because there's wine waiting for us and all that. So please bear that in mind. I see 2, but I want to give Clark the opportunity to.
Well, just something that came up in the fight before, that it could well be that the boom suffix and the boom are acoustically produced in the same way that the vocal sacs. And if that's the case, then that may have implications for how you interpret that. Is that something you have thought of already?
No, at this point, I'm really open to seeing a more detailed analysis of the acoustics of "u" and seeing how this is going to affect these results. If it turns out that you can analyze kraku haku as being krak plus some other operation, phonological operations in language often carry meaning, and you could posit that a certain phonological operation carries meaning. I mean, that's not, such a weird idea to have. So it really depends on the outcome of this acoustic phonetic analysis. Maybe it will lead one to revise the analysis, maybe not.
Yes. You've been waiting very long, so thanks for your patience.
A slight comment. I'd just like to say how impressed and excited I am by the employment of formal models drawn from linguistics to data of this kind. For some time I've been interested in applying truth conditional concepts to animal communication, and I've actually found that you can get a lot of mileage out of truth conditional semantics and elucidate a lot of problems and relating to the differences between animal communication systems and human language. I don't know whether you're sufficiently familiar with the sort of concept of S equals T, if and only if P, but that seems to apply to verbal alarm systems, with obviously the modifications and exceptions and comments that you've made in relation to that. It's like if and only if P, if something in the environment is there. And almost it's when and only when. The problem with language origins is like we have to turn the formula around and say, well, what conditions were necessary to bring about S, where S equals the sign or symbol or whatever, that kind. So it's really exciting that people are working in this field and using these concepts. And
Thank you.
I'm very impressed.
I mean, I certainly do hope that in the end, people working on the very, very hard and very exciting questions of evolutionary origins will at least be able to use, if not this work, then works in this general tradition. That's a hope. Yes, so this is exactly right. I mean, this is the kind of story that one would like to see if the first theory based on lexical variation is correct. One would like to start from the general alarm meaning of croc, which, if what I said is correct, has to be innately given or at least always available, and then explain by which mechanism in the Thai forest, but not on TY, croc ends up acquiring a strengthened meaning which is leopard related. So one would need exactly a story of that form, and it could be that in the intermediate step to this final lexical meaning has itself to do with a rule of pragmatic strengthening. In the data I discussed, the slight weakness of this theory was that because, or if you posited a connection between croc and crocu, and because even in the Thai forest, crocu is a completely general alarm call, you were forced to posit, in addition, a general meaning for croc. The only alternative would be to have a very complicated meaning for u, which somehow manages to take as an input a leopard meaning and return as an output a general alarm meaning. That's not totally impossible, but it looks very odd given the fact that u also applies to hawk, etc. But the general direction is the one that you said.
Thank you very much. Let's thank Philippe. Let's thank also all our speakers for a wonderful day.
So I'd like to just take 1 minute to really say how grateful I am to the organizers. I mean, this is to a certain extent a dream come true, having these kinds of works and the really wonderful work that we saw from specialists of animal communication being presented to linguists. I mean, thank you so much to the organizers for setting this up.
While you've let